A man in a gray robe sits down across from a queen and asks her very politely about the money. He doesn't threaten her. He doesn't need to. Everybody in Westeros already knows what the Iron Bank of Braavos does to people who don't pay. It doesn't send soldiers. It sends gold to whoever hates you most, and then it waits. That's Tycho Nestoris. That's a fantasy show. In April 1201, a lender in a city built on a swamp signed a contract with an army of crusaders. The lender would build them the biggest fleet Europe had put to sea in centuries. The price was 85,000 silver marks. Call it 20 tons of silver. The crusaders showed up short, so the lender didn't sue anybody. It pointed the army at a city and said, "Take that one for us, and we'll call it a payment." 3 years later, that lender owned 3/8 of the Roman Empire. This is real roots, the real history behind the stories you love. Today, Braavos, the Iron Bank, and the Merchant Republic that actually pulled this off. Venice, a city with no king, run by a committee of shopkeepers, that turned money into a weapon so effective, it hijacked a holy war to settle an invoice. So, start with the water. Nobody finds a city in a swamp on purpose. Venice happened because the mainland stopped being survivable. Roman towns along the North Adriatic emptied out. The Huns came through in the 450s, the Lombards arrived in 568. And the people who ran didn't run inland. They ran out into a lagoon of mudflats and reed banks that nobody else wanted. The official founding date is 421, and that's a legend, tidied up centuries later by Venetians who wanted a birthday. What happened was less flattering. People hid in a marsh, and then found out the marsh was the best wall in Italy. Braavos is founded by escaped slaves, hiding in a lagoon behind a fog bank, in a place nobody would look for a city. Venice is refugees hiding in a lagoon behind a sandbar, in a place nobody would want one. And here's how Venice actually defended itself for 1,000 years, which is so much smarter than a statue. The lagoon is shallow, ankle deep in most of it. A ship only reaches the city along a handful of deep channels, and those channels were marked with wooden posts driven into the mud. Brickle. They're still out there today. In a war, you pull the markers up, and your enemy's fleet sails confidently into a foot of water and stops, in full view of the people it came to kill. Braavos gets a 200-foot bronze giant straddling the harbor mouth. Venice had removable signposts. The signposts worked better. The Titan, mind you, isn't Venetian at all. That's the Colossus of Rhodes with the serial numbers filed off. Martin's a magpie. Lagoon from one place, giant from another. But the lagoon came with a problem. No farmland. You can't grow anything in a salt marsh, so from day one this city has to buy its dinner from strangers, which means it has to sell something first. Salt, fish, timber, and people. Early Venice was a slave port. Venetian ships ran captives off the Balkan coast in North Africa, and enough of them were Slavs that it's where our word slave comes from. Pope's bandit, emperor's bandit. Venice kept going because Venice had nothing else to sell yet, which is the sharpest difference in this whole video. And I'm not skating past it. Braavos' founding myth is escaped slaves who outlawed slavery forever, and meant it. Venice's founding business was partly the trade itself. Martin took the lagoon and gave it a conscience it never had. Now the government, and this is where Braavos really starts showing through. By around 726, the Venetians are electing their own duke. Doge in the dialect. Not a king, not a prince, an elected chief executive, chosen by the merchants, and the whole system that grows up around him exists for one reason, to make absolutely certain he never becomes a king. Look at how they picked him after 1268. 30 men drawn by lot from the Great Council, cut to 9 by lot. The 9 elect 40, cut to 12 by lot. The 12 elect 25, cut to 9, the 9 elect 45, cut to 11, and the 11 elect 41, who lock themselves in a room and finally choose the doge. 10 rounds. Lottery, vote, lottery, vote. Gloriously insane, and insane for a reason. You can't bribe a system when nobody knows who you'd have to bribe. Then they tie him down. Every doge swore an oath called the Promissione, rewritten for each new man, and it only ever got longer. He couldn't leave the city without permission. He couldn't open diplomatic mail alone, meet a foreign ambassador alone, or accept a serious gift. And when he died, a commission audited his reign and fined his heirs for anything he'd got wrong. They audited the dead man. In 1297 they closed the door entirely, the Serrata. From then on the Great Council belonged to a fixed list of families, eventually kept in a register they called the Golden Book. If your name was in it, you owned a share of the Republic. If it wasn't, you never would. And the deletion is the monument. A city of masks and secret ballots and stone letterboxes for anonymous accusations, where the worst thing it could do to you wasn't kill you. It was make you no one. Arya would have settled in fine. So how does a swamp with no farms end up rich enough to matter? Two answers, and both of them are the Iron Bank. The first is the Arsenal, a walled state shipyard in the east of the city, 60 acres of it. And at its height something like 16,000 people worked inside. It ran an assembly line 3 centuries before anybody coined the phrase. A finished hull floated down a channel past a row of windows, and out of each window came the next thing it needed: oars, rope, sails, weapons, ship's biscuit. It came out the far end a warship. In 1574, the French King Henry III came to visit, and Venice showed off by assembling and launching a galley in the time it took him to eat dinner. The second answer is duller, and much more important. In 1284, Venice started minting a gold coin called the ducat. 3.5 grams, gold so pure it's about as good as medieval metallurgy could get. And, this is the trick, they never touched it. Not once. Every other government in Europe was quietly shaving its currency to pay for wars. Venice minted that same coin, same weight, same purity, for over 500 years, right up until the Republic died in 1797. Their product wasn't gold. It was the promise that the gold would still be gold next year. That's the Iron Bank's entire brand. They went further. Venice paid for its wars with forced loans, the prestiti. Every wealthy household lent the state a share of its assets and drew interest, and you were allowed to sell that loan on to somebody else at whatever price the two of you agreed. So in the 1200s, on a small island, there's a working market in government debt. Bond trading, before anybody had properly worked out what a bank was. Which brings us to 1201, and the moment this stops being clever and starts being frightening. The Doge of Venice is Enrico Dandolo. He is blind. Villehardouin, a French knight who was in the room and wrote the whole thing down, says his eyes looked normal, but he couldn't see a thing. And he is old, somewhere in his 80s or 90s depending on which historian you trust. They argue about it, and I'm not going to pretend they don't. 6 envoys arrive from France to charter a fleet. There's a crusade planned, aimed at Egypt, and they need ships. Dandolo takes it to the councils, and Venice says yes to a staggering contract. It will transport and feed 33,500 men and 4,500 horses for a year, and throw in 50 war galleys of its own, crewed at its own expense, in exchange for half of everything the crusade conquers. Price for the transport, 85,000 marks. And then Venice does something no other city in Europe could have done. It stops. For more than a year, the Republic suspends normal trade and turns its whole economy over to building this fleet. Summer 1202, the Crusaders start arriving. About 12,000 of them. Not 33, 12. The rest went to other ports or never left home, and the men standing on that sand are personally liable for a fleet built for 3 times their number. Plate, jewelry, everything, and reach roughly 51,000 marks. They're 34,000 short, stranded on an island, entirely surrounded by their creditor. Dandolo doesn't rage. He offers them a payment plan. There's a city up the Dalmatian coast called Zara. Wealthy port, used to be Venetian, defected to the King of Hungary. Take Zara for us, says the blind old man, and we'll postpone the debt. Zara is Christian. The King of Hungary has personally taken the cross. Pope Innocent III forbids it in the strongest terms he's got. November 1202, the crusade sacks Zara anyway, and the Pope excommunicates the entire army. An armed pilgrimage in a state of mortal sin, 3 weeks in, because it couldn't cover a shipping bill. And it doesn't stop there. A Byzantine prince turns up, offering enormous money and troops if they'll put his father back on the throne in Constantinople. And this army, still in debt, already damned, turns east. 12 April 1204. The Crusaders and the Venetians assault the walls of Constantinople from the water. Villehardouin describes the doge standing in the bow of his galley with the banner of St. Mark in front of him, shouting at his crew to run the ship aground and put him on the beach first. A blind man in his 90s, going up a shoreline under fire. The Peruzzi collapsed in 1343. The Bardi followed in 1346. The two largest financial houses on earth, gone, inside 4 years. And Edward III? Fine. Better than fine. In 1346, he won at Crécy. That's the inversion I keep chewing on. On television, Cersei stiffs the Iron Bank, and the Iron Bank quietly starts funding the people who want her dead. So the next generation of Florentines set out to solve it, and the solution is where the Iron Bank's actual shape comes from. 1397, a man named Giovanni de' Medici opens a bank in Florence. The Medici Bank is famous for the wrong reasons: the art, the palaces, the popes. The clever part is the corporate structure, which sounds boring right up until you notice what it's for. It wasn't one company, it was a bundle of separate partnerships. Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, Milan, Avignon, Pisa. Separate contracts, separate books, separate liability. If Bruges drove itself off a cliff, the creditors of Bruges could not come for Rome. And the branch manager wasn't an employee, he was a junior partner with his own money in the pot, which meant his caution was purchased rather than requested. Ask yourself who the Iron Bank actually is. Not a king, not a family with a sigil, a set of key holders, and a polite man in gray who is very clearly not the owner of anything. You can't kill the Iron Bank because there's nobody standing in the middle of it. That's a Medici branch structure with a fantasy paint job. Their best asset wasn't a mine or a fleet either. The Rome branch handled the money of the papal court, the church's accounts, its transfers, its revenues out of every corner of Christendom. And for decades, it was the most profitable thing the family owned. It also came with a collection tool no bank has had before or since. A debtor who wouldn't pay could find the church leaning on him with excommunication on the table. Tycho Nestoris threatens to hire sellswords. The Medici could have your soul repossessed. So they had the structure, and they had the leverage, and in the end, they walked into the identical wall. The London branch, under a manager named Gherardo Canigiani, went deep into lending to Edward IV of England, right through the wars we covered last time. And the Bruges branch, run by Tommaso Portinari, a man with an appetite for princely clients that Florence kept trying and failing to curb, put a fortune into Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. On 5 January 1477, Charles the Bold lost a battle at Nancy. His body turned up in a ditch 2 days later, stripped, frozen into the ice, and by the accounts we have, badly mauled by animals before anyone reached him. You can't foreclose on a corpse in a ditch. The debt died with him. London was written off and shut in 1478. Bruges was wound up behind it. The bank limped to 1494, when the Medici were thrown out of Florence, and the whole thing was seized and scattered. 97 years, killed by exactly what killed the Bardi and the Peruzzi, lending to men who cannot be taken to court. One man beat the trap, and we've done a whole video on him. In 1519, the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire came up, and it was openly for sale, 7 electors, taking bids. Charles of Habsburg won, and the bill came to something like 850,000 florins, of which the Augsburg banker, Jakob Fugger, put up roughly 543,000. 4 years later, Fugger wrote to his emperor, asking for it back, and put in writing that it is well known your imperial majesty could not have acquired the Roman crown without me. His advantage was that he never took promises. He took the mines, Habsburg silver and copper, the actual holes in the actual ground, as security. Own the collateral, and you don't need the borrower to be honest. Which brings me back to Venice, and to a set of horses. 4 bronze horses stand over the front of the Basilica of St. Mark. They came off the Hippodrome in Constantinople in 1204. Dandelo's Crusade. The debt that got paid in a city. Venice bolted them above its cathedral door and left them there for 600 years. Until Napoleon took them to Paris in 1797, and 1815 brought them back. The originals are kept inside now, out of the weather, with copies standing in their place. That's the difference between the fiction and the history, in 4 objects. The Iron Bank collects, and the story moves on. Venice collected, and then mounted the receipt above the front door of its church, where every visitor for 6 centuries could see precisely what happens to people who can't pay. This has been Real Roots, the real history behind the stories you love. Next time, the House of Black and White, a guild of assassins, a temple in a hidden city, and men who could reach anybody. Because there was an order in the mountains of Persia, run by a man Europe called the Old Man of the Mountain, that terrified kings and crusaders alike. And it was better at this than the faceless men.